Welcome to the Bible Search and Rescue podcast. Bible Search and Rescue is part of the Westar Institute. My name is Chad Vinters. I am the director of Bible Search and Rescue and the host of our podcast. And today I am joined by my fellow Westar scholar, colleague, and an awesome human being, Dr. Jeffrey Robbins. So Jeff has got a great list of things that we talk about. First of all, he is a teacher at the Lebanon Valley College in Pennsylvania, and he has an upcoming book entitled The Willing Dam: Faithfulness and Resistance Beyond Belief. That will be coming out from Westar's own press very soon. In addition to that, Jeff also happens to be a tennis coach. He teaches and coaches tennis. He ran a tennis tournament this very morning, and then he was here to be with us this afternoon. All around amazing guy. Rumor has it that he makes a fine quiche as well. But today we're going to be talking about the age of Trump and how Trump has impacted theology and how we do theology in the age of Trump. And Jeff just happens to be an expert in this because he was the co-editor and a contributor to a book entitled Theology in the Age of Trump. He also happened to be the co-chair of the God Seminar, phase one of the God Seminar. And so we are excited to jump in, talk a little bit about the book, and then kind of expand into what all of this looks like today as we are now in 2025, phase two of Donald Trump, and how theology continues to be impacted. Jeff, my friend, it's so good to see you. We had a chance to visit a little bit at the end of May during the conference, and here we are again. Thank you so much for being with us today.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely thrilled to have you here. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about the book as our springboard into today's conversation. So like I said, you were the co-editor and you were a contributor to Theology in the Age of Trump. And if I am correct, this book was an extension of the God Seminar, correct?
Yeah, I could say a lot about like how this book came to be, if you allow me, or
I would love that.
not
Yes.
too boring, sort of behind the scenes. Um, at the time, in addition to being co-chair of the God Seminar, I was also, I think, chair of the Board of Trustees. And during the lead up to the election and the original first election, 2016. The book came about because we at Westar were trying to figure out ways in which we could break through and I guess add our voice to some of the debates swirling around the concerns over Trump during the first election cycle in 2016. At the time, we were kind of experimenting with really kind of remaking Westar as a think tank.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the ideas was we should publish a series of white papers and then get scholars together to discuss the theses or the arguments from those white papers about contemporary events or kind of political affairs or whatever the case might be. So in light of that, during the AAR-SBL meeting of 2017, we gathered a group of about 12 scholars, all who had been at least loosely affiliated with the God Seminar. And we just asked them the basic question. What does it mean to think about religion in America? And what does it mean to do theology in the age of Trump?
Mhm.
And we gave them kind of whatever leeway they wanted to kind of explore that question. And what emerged from it was this book. Most of the papers were their chapters were the papers that were presented. There was no effort at coming to some kind of single thesis or some single argument. Instead, we wanted to see the range of different responses, theological responses to the concerns. And if anything, the one thing that became apparent to us and the reason why it was our subtitle was that there was this kind of growing awareness that something was shifting in the kind of political religious terrain in the United States.
Mhm.
Um, and at the time, we were really one of the first to name it as Christian nationalism, and even sort of go further than that and identify it specifically as a kind of white Christian nationalism.
Mhm.
Um, so up to that point, the religious right, you know this history better than most. The religious right, had been very effective at mobilizing religious voters.
Mhm.
They had been very effective at elevating certain, hot button cultural issues.
Yeah.
And they really were asking for a seat at the table. Um, And there were these serious, like every time one of their own was elected, or every time that they sort of helped sort of put someone over the top, especially in the presidency, there was this kind of sense of disillusionment and frustration that the you know, president didn't go far enough. I'm dating back to Jimmy Carter, who was a Democrat, but like a true evangelical Christian. Reagan, who his first Supreme Court appointment disappointed the religious right. Um, George W. Bush was a true Bible Belt evangelical Christian. And one of his first acts as president was to establish the Office for kind of faith-based action to try to
Mhm.
integrate the kind of religiosity and the actual making of policy and delving out of public funds. But it never sort of materialized into the kind of movement or policy gains that I think some people dreamed of. And so it was so interesting about Trump, even though he had no credentials as an evangelical Christian, um, the kind of promises he made to evangelicals as it in a kind of transactional way in which he um, goes about his business. Um, there's never been a president in which the religious right was there. No one has been more faithful to the aims of the religious right than President Trump.
Mhm.
Um, and it goes beyond simply being, this is the kind of argument I make sort of subsequent to the book itself. It goes beyond merely being an electioneering strategy. It's not about just what do you need to say in order to win these votes, or what do religious leaders need to say to mobilize these voters. What's different about Christian nationalism is it becomes a governance strategy. How can we put people into place to actually affect systemic institutional change at the highest levels of the American government? Uh,
Mhm.
and so I think a lot of the chapters in this book are beginning to see that, even though it's just a few months after Trump first takes office when these papers were first delivered. A lot of the concerns about the kind of racial and racializing and racist elements of the Trump administration were identified. A lot of
Mhm.
the elements about sort of the media sphere and the role it played in our kind of hyper-partisan politics that was identified. Um, and so I think the book really stands the test of time in the sense that um, unfortunately, this topic is still very much with us. I think sort of more and more people are recognizing that there is something different going on with the Trump administration than things we've seen before.
Yeah. No, I mean, beautifully summarized. And something that has really stood out to me about this administration now, and we're in round two of it, is thinking about the way that, especially the Christian right, had such a axe to grind about leaders have to be godly people. You know, that there is this, you have to be a moral person. Bill Clinton, John Edwards, right? These men, you adulterers, if you commit adultery, you can't be trusted to tell the truth. If you lie about it, you can't be trusted to tell the truth. And then comes Trump. And I mean, not only does he have a litany of background of adulterous behavior in his past. And I mean, the man went on Howard Stern for years and used to brag about his three ways and his four ways and all of these women he's had sex with. Everybody knew in the lead up to 2016 that he had paid hush money to an adult film actress that he had an affair with. And what's so fascinating is that the Christian right didn't care. They brushed every single step of that under the rug towards the end. And I think you said it most beautifully, the transactional piece, right? And I'm just kind of curious, did this come up in terms of in the book, the way that this supposed moral boundaries that the Christian right had just seemed to vanish when it came to Donald Trump because of the potential for gaining power?
Yeah, I mean that's what I call in my chapter the white Christian nationalist hustle.
Hmm.
And I call it a hustle because I think that sort of transactional politics that was affected by evangelical leaders and much of the white evangelical population who supported Trump in overwhelming numbers, 85%, was they showed that these things that they had been talking about for decades, about the need for kind of righteous, morally upstanding sort of leaders to reflect their values, that they didn't really care about those things at all. That was never really what it was about. Um, that they, and I think that after the book, I mean, what we see sort of most glaringly as the kind of case in point was when the Christian, I'm going to get the name of the publication wrong, the Evangelical Christian Monthly publication that came out against Trump when he was running in 2020. Um, and they published a editorial basically um, condemning sort of Trump and citing his sort of moral failure. They were being consistent with what they'd been saying for decades. And
Hmm.
within a very short period of time, the editor in chief was removed from his position. And there was widespread sort of condemnation for
Hmm.
him and the publication for um, sort of turning on this sort of movement. And so I think what's so hard to understand and so hard to fathom is, and I think it's becoming clear now, as everyone on the right seems to be getting in line, is that there were voices of opposition. There were sort of even sort of leaders on the right, not just sort of other candidates vying for the presidency or the nomination, but other sort of evangelical leaders who spoke out against Trump and said that this is a devil's bargain, that I'm unwilling to go there. But they were isolated, they were ostracized, they were silenced, they were bullied until now, the point where there really is sort of no resistance on the right whatsoever. And the kind of the strength of our, I don't want to get too theoretical here, but I think the strength of a democratic system is when you have sort of independent, autonomous, intermediary institutions who
Hmm.
are willing to sort of represent their interest forcefully, to articulate their positions, and because they have their own kind of base of power or their own sphere of sovereignty, they can sort of do so without being intimidated. And what's happened now is that there's so few independent, intermediary, autonomous groups or voices or institutions left.
Hmm.
And those few that there are, there's a strategy to why Trump is going after universities and
Yep.
why he's going after law firms, and why he's going after the federal bureaucracy, because those are sort of independent bases of power.
Yep.
And the more they can intimidate those voices and those institutions, the more their kind of stranglehold on power becomes absolute.
Yep. Yeah. And by going after education, you can create a full-blown system of propaganda. Yeah, that that you will inculcate every student with. I found it very fascinating over the last about 3 or 4 years where you have these various conservative groups, whether it's going after the book bans or trying to take over school boards and so forth, constantly decrying indoctrination. When we know that's not really what they're concerned with. They're not concerned about their kids being indoctrinated. What they're concerned with is the fact that their kids are indoctrinated and they want nothing taught that challenges that indoctrination. That's really what it is. They are core chief indoctrinators, almost to the point where the lack of actual willingness to critically examine any view very much gets into the line of what we see of cults and how cultic behavior takes place. But, you scream indoctrination and you cry it from the rooftops to try and, of course, silence everybody else. But we really know, any of us who are paying attention, that it has nothing to do with actually being indoctrinated. It's to the challenge of indoctrination.
Yeah, and I'm sure you know, and this is the first move in the totalitarian playbook,
Yeah.
um, to to force the public or to whittle away at the public's trust
Mhm.
in the truth or and the differentiation or discrimination between sort of truth and falsehoods, fact and fiction. And that kind of steady drumbeat of calling sort of things fake news or attacking sort of news reporting or all these sort of independent voices again. I mean, it has this cumulative effect.
Yeah.
And I think it's why we see sort of the difference between sort of Trump 1 and Trump 2. There's a much more, the kind of ground has been cleared. Um, Ezra Klein likes to talk about, the New York Times opinion columnist likes to talk about the fact that Trump really hasn't changed, right? I mean, he's a man without sort of uh, any sort of guardrails or inhibitions.
Yep.
But, he's managed now, or the people around him have managed now to sort of get rid of those people who might sort of put the guardrails up. And so that's where we are. And I just wanted to say one more thing about the hustle,
Mhm.
or the con job, or whatever we want to call it. I think we just had the passage and the signing of the big beautiful bill
Yep.
yesterday, right? And this every news account you read talks about this as the kind of signature sort of uh, agenda item for Trump's second term, much like the tax cuts were the signature achievement of his first term. And so, even though he's elected on a as a populist, and even though sort of all the exit polling sort of suggests that the working class, not just sort of white, but sort of multi-ethnic, sort of multiracial working class vote has supported him in larger numbers than any Republican candidate ever,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
Um, what you see in the big beautiful bill is a massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich,
Yep.
right? Um, Likewise in first term with the tax cuts, you saw a massive transfer of wealth. And so while Trump is saying sort of America first, while he's ingratiating himself with the working class, the decisions being made are anything but in their favor and their support, or it's not in any way going to make a tangible difference in their lives. The policy is not intended to help them. Instead, its policy is intended to help the rich. Um, and so the amazing thing about him as a political figure is how he's managed to, I don't even think it's a matter of fooling people, but he's managed to convince sincere, earnest, Bible-believing Christians that he is an agent of God.
Mhm.
He's managed to convince um, working class people sort of struggling to make ends meet that this sort of transfer of wealth somehow is um, in support of them and their needs and
Mhm.
their desires. And he's doing this all in plain sight, right? So
Mhm.
it's a masterful con job. Or there's something else sort of underneath the American psyche that is so deeply disturbing. And I think this is where, going back to the book, this is what the book is trying to get at in doing theology in the age of Trump. Because so often I'm sure you hear this in some classes you teach or, people you have conversations with. So often people try to distinguish between like true Christianity and false Christianity. And whenever they see someone who is a hypocrite, let's say, um, they'll say, yeah, but they're just sort of not, living in accordance with, the true Christian faith. Um, and I think that's what you get here, this idea that like, well, this is true Christianity, this is false Christianity, this is good Christianity, this is bad Christianity. But what if what the Trump phenomena really reveals to us is that those are kind of false distinctions we're making. And it immunizes us from really exploring what is it at the heart of American Christianity that
Mhm.
allows this to take place in its name. It's, and I think that kind of that soul searching takes place in certain corners, no doubt. Um,
Mhm.
it took place in the heart of Western Europe after World War II, certainly. Um, and sometimes what one learns from that is not something you want to know. Like that maybe that there's this deep rooted sort of anti-Semitism at the very sort of root of Christian identity formation. That's what
Mhm.
German Christians had to confront
Yeah.
uh, in the 20th century. So what is it that we as Americans have to confront about how it is that sort of our practice and our understanding of Christianity allows us to sort of allows this to go on in its name? And I think
Yeah.
that's where things get very sort of difficult.
Yeah, I mean, beautifully put, and hauntingly put as well, because you're right. Like when you look at the way, watching this going back to 2016, watching that shift where I saw, people that I know who went from a president needs to be a godly man to I'm not voting for a pastor, right? That the local pastor has a higher moral standard than the president of the United States is just so mind-numbingly stupid on so many levels. But it reflects, like you said, it's the deal with the devil. It's the exchange that if we give this man our voices, he'll give us power. And what's so fascinating about it is there seems to be this legitimate fantasy within much of this Christian nationalism about the complete destruction of the secular state and this vision of having this Christian nation, which what you just said, of course, cuts to the core of that, which is, well, what would that be? What does it mean to be Christian, or what is Christianity? And I think we understand it's not really a Christian nation. It's more of a white nationalist nation, right? It's a return to the pre-civil rights era. It's a return to some idealized vision of the past that doesn't exist, right? Because there was no idealized era of the United States. And yet you come back to and you hit the perfect issue, which is how many people have been willing to absolutely sacrifice all of this, sacrifice personal freedom, sacrifice all of this for what we can't really explain. Now, there's some vision that if we give Trump this power and if we give more wealth to the wealthy, it's going to create this paradise of golden age buying, and we're all going to have homes and we're all going to live in this utopia that those of us who have paid any attention, we know it's not coming. I'm just kind of curious. Do you have any theories as to how we got to this point where people can literally vote against their own self-interests in this fashion and somehow look at it and say, you know what, it's all really going to pay off somehow? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Um, Too many sort of thoughts to say anything coherently. I mean, I think much of it is the politics of grievance. Um, I think there's, you know, gnashing of teeth or concern over demographic changes. The replacement theory is something that sort of, even if people don't sort of know it by name, it's something sort of people are deeply concerned about. Um, I think sort of underneath much of it is the looming climate crisis, and this idea that we might be living in the most sort of stable time in our lifetimes right now.
Yeah.
That things are only going to get more uprooted, more chaotic. Um, that there is a kind of rush to kind of um, fortify oneself as much as you can uh, before the kind of refugee crisis becomes even sort of more out of control, before sort of borders are unable to kind of really sort of maintain sort of any sense of national sovereignty.
Mhm.
Um, there's a reason why for decades it was the Department of Defense that invested sort of more money in researching climate change than any other national agency, because they realized that this was going to lead to global political upheaval, change sort of migration patterns, um, lead to food crisis, water shortage. And so I, I think that there is, whether we know it or not, on some visceral level, there is a kind of awareness that crisis is near. And so there's this willingness that we will mortgage our future, because who knows sort of what tomorrow holds, right? We'll sacrifice any sort of planning, any kind of investment in those sorts of things because we've got to get what we can while we can. Um, and it's, the kind of giveaways to the oil and gas industry. I mean, we're going far afield here, but the kind of reneging on the all the kind of green um, initiatives that were put into place by the Biden initiation and the big beautiful bill. I mean, none of that sort of makes sense. Um, these are jobs. These are sort of future jobs. These are sort of future investments. It's going to make us more resilient as an economy. So why disinvest in that? Unless there's some kind of, I don't know, unless there's some kind of ideology behind it, unless there's some kind of panic behind it, or unless it's just one sort of huge money grab. And of course, that's always part of it, right? When we're
Always
talking
is.
about politics, but I really think that there is a kind of cultural anxiety that I think you can sort of tie back to the climate crisis that leads us to think very differently about our future, or maybe put better, leads us to sacrifice our future in the
Mhm.
hope of fortifying sort of us in this sort of present moment. And so if our elected officials are making those kinds of decisions, then I think that sort of trickles down and sort of ordinary citizens are thinking like, well, I got to get mine. And they look around like, who's threatening to sort of take what I'm owed from me? And that sort of fuels this politics of grievance.
Yeah.
So I mean, there are some sort of really good kind of cultural philosophers and cultural critics out there, sort of, I think, theorizing this in a pretty interesting way and talking about sort of a kind of otherworldly sort of ethos. I mean, that helps make sense of why it is our billionaires are want to go to outer space so desperately. What is that a symptom of? Um, but I think that that kind of our relationship to the earth, our cultural anxiety over climate, I think fuels this sort of extremist politics that we're sort of living with today.
Well, first of all, I'm going to get a drink for
Sorry.
welcome back to our depressing podcast. No, I'm just joking. No, but I mean it hits a very just a horrifying issue because you're right. There is this, it's almost like a cosmic rock star approach, right? Like we're gonna burn out now. We're gonna burn the candles at both end, whatever that takes. I don't care what Donald Trump does to this group or that group or to the future. I want my money now, right? Like I want to live large. I want to, and it's baffling. One of the things that has fascinated me so much, I think, as well as there's the ego tied up in it, is I'm continuing to read these stories about people who, the avid diehard Trump supporters, who are now being hurt by his policies. And they can't bring themselves to actually criticize him. Right.
Hmm.
And I just read, just there's another one this week, this couple, hardcore flying the MAGA flag, and wife just got detained by ICE. And, the friends are like, take down the flag, take down. No, I just can't do that. I believe in what he's doing. Like your wife is in custody, bro, and you still can't take down the, no, we're still, it's mind blowing,
Yeah.
to watch people absolutely sell themselves, even their own freedom and their own, self worldview about their value as human beings for this movement.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a really powerful example. And I've heard similar stories as well. There's the podcast, the New York Times podcast. I think it's called The Run Up or The
Mhm.
Rundown. I don't know if you know it. In the lead up to the election, there was an excellent reporter and interviewer who was basically trying to give the kind of grassroots kind of report on what people were really thinking. Get outside of Washington, go to different towns, different counties, talk to sort of ordinary people, and what's the vibe? Um, and right from the start, um, the vibe he was sensing was, everyone thought Biden was too old, but yet the Democratic Party was going to sort of push him forward, and there was this sense of like deep sort of disillusionment and frustration that sort of party officials really weren't listening to the public. Um, that tracked with me sort of early on, just like, this seems so obvious when you're actually talking to people, but then, the party itself seems to be shooting itself in the foot.
Yeah.
I mention all that because they did a great job of tracking a couple of undecided voters, like in swing states like Ohio and Michigan, Pennsylvania, the Rust Belt, Some of them were laid off auto factory line workers, and they went through this protracted period of kind of weighing their decision of who they were going to vote for. Um, and the majority of them, once the election happened, they sort of talked to them. The majority of them ended up turned and voted for Trump just because they felt like the system itself is not working. It's broken. At least he's acknowledging that the system's not working and he's willing to shake it up. And so I'm willing to take a chance. I mean, I don't know, maybe I don't like him, maybe I don't trust him, but at least he's not trying to tell me everything's good when it's not. And he's not defending the system. He's not defending the status quo, right? So that was, up to the election. About 2 months ago, right in the midst of, the kind of chaos over the tariffs and our trade policies or lack of trade policies or whatever it was. And there were a lot of economic indicators at that point saying that sort of things weren't going well. The host of the podcast went back to these same people who were late deciding Trump voters And and I think the expectation that he had and the expectation I would have had would be like, oh shoot, we made a mistake. That, yes, I wanted someone to shake up the system, but it looks like this person doesn't have a plan. It looks like everything's backfiring. But it was not that. They were basically um, willing to give him a very long leash.
Hmm.
They were basically saying, yes, we knew that there was going to be upheaval, that there was going to be chaos, um, but they were so desperate for any kind of change that they were willing to sort of put up with what they considered to be a bunch of sort of bad decisions, bad communications, bad outcomes in the present. And so I mean, I think a lot of people are familiar with the kind of thesis about what's the matter with Kansas. Like it's through cultural politics that people, sort of in the American Midwest especially, were led to vote against their own economic self-interests.
Hmm.
This was the great sort of um, strategy of the Republican Party, or the great victory of the Republican Party. But this is something different. Uh,
Hmm.
it's it. And it is this, maybe it's sort of just a kind of generalized sort of anarchy that like that eh, things are so bad, or the level of trust, of public trust, is so low that anything's better than that. But like it's interesting, like here you have these ordinary sort of voters who aren't sort of in touch, aren't sort of making these sort of big decisions, who are in some cases sort of low informed voters. And it's why
Hmm.
they're kind of undecided to the very end. But they're willing to make this long-term calculation. Whereas the insiders, the Washington insiders, the corporate decision makers, they are sacrificing the future, or they're basically saying sort of, we don't care about the future, that
Hmm.
we're just sort of focusing on what we can get right now. So that mismatch to me is the one that sort of causes me such anguish. I mean,
Yeah.
so on the backs of these ordinary people who are willing to kind of make a kind of long-term calculation, even if they are hurting economically, you have these other people who are basically, stripping them blind, robbing them blind. And so I don't know. I don't know what to say about that beyond it's a conundrum.
Yeah. Well, and it reflects something very problematic in our critical thinking. Because it's the whole notion that I've heard so many times, well, we want someone to come in and shake things up. That's not a strategy. Right. I mean, shaking things up would be just walking into the Senate chambers and just shooting everybody in the Senate, right? That would be a shakeup. Is that a good strategy for making positive long-term change? Of course not. Right. And that's what's kind of befuddled me about this demographic that consistently talks about, well, we just want someone to shake it up. Well, that doesn't mean anything, right? If you want someone to shake it up, what specifically do you want shaken up? What is the change that you want to see? Because by and large, the Trump administration's campaign was largely built on xenophobia and transphobia. Right? That's what it was. The everyday people. It didn't matter the fact that, yeah, you're not gonna get taxed on your tips, right? I mean, that's small potato stuff, right? That's chitlins to the big picture of what the ultra wealthy are going to get. But what you should really be concerned about are brown people coming across the border and trans women in sports, right? There's 10 trans women in all of college sports, but that is a national crisis that has to be addressed. And you just kind of sit back and you go, wow. And people really bought into that. They really accepted this is the most pressing thing we have to deal with.
Yeah.
And I mean, and that brings us into now, and I'm kind of interested to hear your take on it because so now we're in round two. We're only 6 months in. It feels like it's been 4 years, and we've got three and a half more to go of this. So we just had our latest update, which is that in conjunction with that great Christian group down in Florida, we have Alligator Alcatraz. So you quite literally have these self-professed fundamentalist, great godly people who have whipped up the equivalent of a concentration camp in the swamp, and they are bragging about foreigners who might escape being eaten by pythons and alligators, right? It's like watching the original Running Man movie, right? It just gets more bizarre every day. What is your thought on alligator Alcatraz as we talk?
I was not expecting to go there. Um, I I'm saddened by the the fetish we've made out of cruelty,
Oh
and
God.
and 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 just on the sort of most basic level, I want to sort of say how unchristian can you be? Um, I mean, going back to our earlier conversation, I mean, I'm always hesitant to label sort of true Christianity from false Christianity because I think it sort of lets religion off the hook in some ways.
Yeah.
But
They
uh,
almost take it as a challenge now too, right? Like if you say, how cruel can you be? Oh, we can be worse, right?
yeah, yeah, I mean, there's just a there, but there is this kind of celebration, um, kind of perverse celebration of cruelty for cruelty's sake. Um, and in some ways, there will be sort of stories of things that are being sort of imagined actually happening, and we've kind of prepared our souls for it in some ways. So the shock and awe gets sort of lessened or domesticated somehow. And yeah, I mean, beyond sort of that, I don't have much to say. So just thinking about sort of what we know about historical Jesus and the Jesus movement as a counter-imperial movement, or at least elements of it being sort of counter-imperial movement, like the idea of the cross itself as a symbol of Roman imperial sort of violence, um, and the kind of painfulness of crucifixion as the kind of reveling in sort of Roman power over its subjects, right? And so this profound perverse reversal that's taken place, that the
Yep.
religion sort of lives in Jesus's name, is now the one reveling and making a fetish out of imperial violence or out
Yep.
of state violence in this case. Um, And that's where without sort of saying this is true Christianity and this is false Christianity, I think that there are resources within our religious traditions to say enough is enough, to say no to this, to point out the kind of the cognitive sort of disconnect between sort of what has long been sort of championed within these traditions about sort of liberation, about sort of solidarity versus this brute and brutalizing sort of form of state power that is a perennial human temptation, right? We know that.
As I have put it to others, um, Christians in this country have become the persecutors. They are. That's what it's boiled down to. If you took any number of these things, if you took assigning laws against transgender people and you applied that towards Christians, that we don't want Christians in the bathrooms, we don't want Christian books in the library, we don't want public facing Christian events of any kind, it would be deemed immediate persecution by the same Christians now cheering this on. If Christianity were deemed illegal and we started saying, we're going to put all of you in this alligator Alcatraz, and if you escape, the pythons and the alligators are going to eat the Christians. Christians would be screaming from the rooftops, it's the end of days, this is persecution. But when it's the Christians doing the persecuting, it's just good government strategy.
Yeah, and so much theater, right?
Yeah.
A theater of cruelty, not absurdity, but actual cruelty. And I th and just I mean, you started sort of this line of questioning, talking about the success and in Trump's at least advertising campaign of being sort of against communities of color, people of color. and against sort of trans people, right? The commercials that we know that were so effective,
Yep.
and and mobilizing that sort of that grievance, right? I just think back to that really sort of illuminating part of the conference we just had, the West Star conference we had in San Diego. I think it sort of came to the fore for me in the discussion between our colleagues, John Caputo and Karen Bray. Um, Caputo, provided that sort of narrative that this is where Democrats messed up, like by focusing too much on wokeness. Um, or sort of the minoritized or the marginalized, that this was easily turned into a kind of electioneering strategy for the Republicans. And and Karen's response to that was that's sort of too easy, and the kind of exit polls don't reflect that reality as much as we think it did. There was a lot more going on, and is it ever a bad thing to sort of stand up for the marginalized and the oppressed, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I just think that um, I think um, progressive-minded Christians, and I think sort of the Democratic Party, not that I'm equating these sort of whatsoever, I think they have to sort of think a lot about sort of, you know, the level of commitment and level of solidarity um, we are willing to show to those who are sort of most vulnerable today.
Mhm.
Um, and and by all accounts, it doesn't look like it's a winning political strategy,
No.
right? Um, but likewise, I mean, isn't that the story of the gospel?
Right.
I mean, Jesus's crucifixion wasn't a winning strategy. I mean, by some, maybe the Gospel of John would say it was. It was all according to plan, right? But I mean, this idea of that somehow sort of the God might be at work in unseen ways, the whole tradition of the theology of cross, where we see sort of loss and suffering, sort of God is able to sort of use that and and turn that into achieving sort of God's righteous aims, or where we see victory and strength and power. That's weakness, ultimately. It belies a weakness and an insecurity. Um, and so I think that um, this theater of cruelty and of the display of kind of power just for the sake of the display of power.
Mhm.
I think I pray that one day that will be exposed. Um, but for now, um, the kind of political winds are behind its back.
Yeah. If you will not willingly give yourself to our vision of the gospel, we will force you through the sword of the government.
Yeah.
We're going to do it. If you're not willing to, not choose to be gay, right? I don't know how many times do we have to hear that. Then we will punish you for it, right?
Yeah, and I mean, let me go back to what we opened up with the idea. What's different about Christian nationalism than the old sort of evangelical religious right playbook?
Mhm.
I mean, the old religious right evangelical playbook was still sort of mired in a kind of Protestant sensibility that was like, let's go back to the Bible. Um, you know, sola scriptura. Um, and the Bible ultimately is our final authority. And maybe there were profound misreadings and misapplications of the Bible, right? But at least that was part of the sensibility. And there was an effort to kind of purify and reform the faith. That was part of the Protestant sensibility or the evangelical sensibility. And a very sort of profound anti-institutionalism at the heart of that, a kind of distrust of power and distrust of human institutions, right? I think what's different now with the Christian nationalist is that they have basically said, like, it's not about we don't want to go back to the Bible necessarily. We want to go back to Constantine. We
Hmm.
want to go back to the days in which sort of Rome itself was converted to Christianity. And and Christians began to realize what they could do with the backing of state power or with the blessing of state power. And so that's what's different about Christian nationalism. Um, it's willing to wield that power to achieve its aims.
Yeah.
Um, and like the aim is for a kind of wholesale transformation of American society. And the idea like what the religious right has been able to accomplish within our court system, Supreme Court, um,
Mhm.
and the federal benches, they want to achieve in all aspects of society,
Yep.
in our educational system, in our sort of entertainment complex, in our sort of businesses. I mean, the whole Seven Mountains Mandate is about this wholesale transformation. And they believe that not only God is on their side, but they believe that they have a successful playbook because they've been so enormously successful
Yeah.
in converting the courts, right? So now it's just a matter of sort of taking on these new targets in a systematic way, one by one, till all the dominoes fall.
Yeah. And the people are just handing it right to them.
Yeah.
That's the sad thing, right? Is that you've got these people saying, "Will you give me cheaper eggs?" Then yes, I'll give this to you. Yeah, I don't care who it hurts. Like if it gives me cheaper eggs, that's okay because it's not me, at least for now.
And I'm sure you're more sensitive to this than me. Like, and then when there's no and when they don't get the cheaper eggs, then there just becomes a kind of rationalizing of that.
Oh yeah.
Much like a kind of, a prophet who says Christ will return in the year, what year? 1861, 1889, whatever. And it doesn't happen. And then they say, well, yeah, that's right. Our calculations were slightly off, come back next year.
Yeah.
And the movement sort of lives on, right? I mean, how many movements have we seen throughout history of these kind of declarative, sort of prophetic claims that turn out to be unfounded, but then sort of the movement continues
Yeah.
after it's been exposed, right? And so likewise, I mean, yeah, we're supposed to bring prices down. I voted, I don't like any of the nonsense, but at least it's going to sort of help my pocketbook. And meanwhile, sort of all the decisions being made are kind of exacerbating sort of many of the problems economically, right? And we have this sort of vast transfer of wealth. But now we just move on to the next explanation, right? And then you have this kind of, it's almost like this continual kind of filibuster. Trump is so good at just sort of delaying any kind of accountability, right? And the courts have given them all the sort of decisions he needs to do that, that like lower courts can't have a universal injunction, right? So Trump can just sort of sue or he can sort of make any sort of executive order. And then by the time it actually makes its way to the Supreme Court, the damage has already been done,
Yep.
right?
Yep. And he's got the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who's already said he has outright immunity to do it all, no matter what he does, because we need a strong executive, right? We need someone who can take action, no matter what the end result is.
I mean, to
And
me, it's this whole question about like how do we imagine the future and how does that imagination of our future sort of impact how we're living in the present? I mean, to me, that sort of whole, I mean, I think that explains so much beyond sort of merely this being a power grab. It's about that sort of we have basically sort of sacrificed our future and have decided sort of this moment is all we've got. And so we got to sort of take whatever we can right now. And that goes from the top all the way to the bottom.
well, this was a I mean, it's a hell of a conversation.
Uh,
Not gonna really cheer anybody up too much, I don't think.
Except that, except that there are resources within our religious traditions. I mean, I do want to insist on that point that
Yeah.
um, not only sort of examples or exemplars of resistance and faithfulness beyond belief, as the subtitle of my forthcoming book says, but
Yes.
but but just I think history is always sort of happening. We sort of narrow in sort of on this present. That's why I wanted to sort of focus on this kind of time temporal dimension. Um, but events sort of happen sometimes out of nowhere. 10, 15, or 15 years ago, no one could have seen the Trump phenomenon coming quite like this, I don't think. Um, so there is, if not reason for hope, there's a urging to remaining sort of faithful to the truth as you know it. And who knows what might happen as a result.
Yeah.
God help us.
Yeah. And that's a key thing is that but that requires the responsibility of people, many of whom, like you said, have, openly professed their loyalty to Trump, realized that it did not pan out. Maybe rather than try to stick by your guns or excuse it, that might require a little bit of ownership of saying, yeah, I made the wrong choice here.
Yeah. And isn't
But
that so much of what Bible search and rescue is all about, right? That people have these sort of questions and right now sort of the market's flooded with sometimes like really sort of superficial,
yeah,
bad or misguided answers. But you're trying to provide a kind of alternative resource. Um, so I'm really sort of grateful for the work you're doing on that front.
well, thank you. And we are grateful for your work as well. We have been talking with Dr. Jeffrey Robbins. So you can go get a copy of Doing Theology in the Age of Trump, or it's just Theology in the Age of Trump,
No,
right?
doing theology. There
It
it
is
is.
it? Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. So, Doing Theology in the Age of Trump. Great book. A lot of excellent contributors on that one. So you'll get a range of voices there. And then the upcoming book, The Willing Damned, Faithfulness and Resistance Beyond Belief. When are you expecting that one?
It is imminent within a month or two. It should be out and being published by the West Star Press. So
Nice. Are we doing pre-orders on that?
I don't think so. I see no evidence of that.
Okay, we
Uh,
have no evidence of pre-orders.
yeah, no, I mean, I haven't seen it listed or anything like that. I should know the answer to that. I'm not good at plugging a book.
Not, I mean, I'll plug it because, I mean, obviously, what you've heard, Jeff is an extremely insightful, thoughtful, intelligent human being who's put a lot of thought into what we see taking place. Uh, get the book. There's a lot to be said about what's going on here. And Jeff, like I said, I know it's not the most upbeat conversation to have, but damned if it isn't an important one that we've dealt with today. And I really appreciate you taking some time away from your family on a Saturday to chat with us about this.
My pleasure. Thanks for your time and for all the good work you're doing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to all of you who have tuned in. My name is Chad Venters. I am a West Star scholar, and West Star continues to try to bring you the very best scholarship we can, accessible to the public to help anybody who's looking to understand. This has been the Bible Search and Rescue podcast. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, go out and make the world a better place for somebody else today. Thank you.